She was the kind of girl who always sat in the second row. Not the front, where the confident ones lived, and not the back, where those who had already given up slouched in shadows. She didn't ask questions in class, not because she had none, but because hers always felt too simple, too fragile, too small. She wore oversized sweaters, kept her head down, and folded her hands so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned pale. People called her quiet. But quiet isn't the right word when your silence is just fear in disguise. The day she walked into the auditorium, she didn't expect anything more than a lecture. Just another event, another famous guest, another list of impressive credentials and rehearsed wisdom. What she didn't expect, what she couldn't have imagined, was that Toni Morrison would change her life without raising her voice. There were hundreds of students packed into the hall that day. Some brought notebooks, others their phones, ready to capture whatever quote-worthy moment might come. But she brought something else, a kind of invisible question. A longing, a quiet ache buried deep beneath layers of comparison, disappointment, and a slow-burning belief that she just wasn't enough. And then, somehow, somewhere in the middle of the Q&A, her hand went up, surprised even her. The microphone was passed down. Her voice trembled. "Miss Morrison," she said, eyes barely meeting the stage. What if I don't feel like I'm ever going to be good enough? Not for this school. Not for this world." You could feel the air shift. No one laughed. No one moved. And Toni Morrison looked at her. Not past her. Not through her. But at her. And what she said next wasn't grand or philosophical. It wasn't even long. But it made every other answer that came before it feel like noise. The day she met to. It wasn't even the kind of day that warned you something important was about to happen. There was no golden sunrise slicing through the clouds, no prophetic wind brushing against windows, no deep cinematic tension humming through the air. It was just a gray and ordinary, the kind of day where you forget what you wore, where your coffee tasted like every coffee before it, and where walking across campus felt more like drifting than arriving. The girl in the second row had pulled her hoodie over her ears. Not because it was cold, but because it made her feel invisible. That was the comfort she knew best, the comfort of Bay. She hadn't planned on going to the event. The flyer had been up for a week on the bulletin board next to the dining hall. An evening with Toni Moore. Blackett. Her paper was due. Her shift at the library had run late. Her imposter syndrome was particularly loud that week. And anyway, why would someone like her need to sit in a room with a Nobel laureate? What could she possibly gain that she hadn't already seen on Yout? But there was something about the way her feet had turned toward the hall when she left the library, even before her mind caught up. She wasn't heading home. She wasn't even really heading anywhere. Just walking, until she found herself pushing open the heavy auditorium doors, the kind that groaned as if protesting your entry. The room was bigger than she expected. Colder too. Rows and rows of beige seats, a long table at the front, microphones coiled like snakes, and a simple podium with a single white spotlight aimed down like heaven itself had chosen this one patch of floor. She picked a seat in the second row. Not too close, not too far. It was instinct at this point to stay somewhere in between. Students filed in with the buzz of anticipation. Some wore Toni's books like Armor, Beloved, The Bluest Eye, dog-eared and underlined. Others had notebooks ready, waiting to harvest every word as though proximity to greatness might sprinkle a little magic into their own struggling sentences. There were professors in long coats, alumni in smart glasses, cameras, phones, whispers about whether she'd be tired, whether she'd talk about race, whether she'd read aloud. But no one whispered about what they hoped to feel. And that girl, the one in the second row, she didn't carry a book, or a notebook, or a question, just that quiet ache. It had been growing for months, maybe years. That gnawing feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she was always 2 steps behind. She wasn't the most articulate in class. She hadn't won the writing contests her peers casually aced. She didn't have that edge everyone kept talking about. The one that gets you published before 25 or invited to summer fellowships in New York. She was always the editor's assistant, never the author. The listener, never the speaker. And though her grades were good and her resume was slowly filling out, something deeper inside her kept shrinking. It whispered things. You don't belong here. You're just lucky they haven't noticed yet. If they really knew you, they wouldn't call you talented. She didn't even call herself a writer anymore. Just a girl who tried. So when Toni Morrison finally walked out onto that stage, small in stature, wrapped in gray, her white dreadlocks coiled like the wisdom of centuries, it didn't feel like meeting a celebrity. Felt like meeting a mirror. Not the kind that reflects what's on the outside, but the kind that reflects what your spirit forgot it looked like. The room clapped, but Morrison didn't smile in the way public figures usually do, with polished charm. She nodded, slowly, almost solemnly, as if she were acknowledging something sacred, something unspoken between herself and the audience. Something like, "We're not here to impress each other. We're here to remember something we've forgotten." Her voice was lower than expected. Not booming, not theatrical, but grounded, like the earth when it rumbles before a storm. And when she spoke her first sentence, it wasn't about herself. It wasn't about awards or books or fame. It was a question. "What does it mean?" she asked. "To belong to yourself?" There was a pause. Not the awkward kind, the holy kind, because no one had ever asked it quite like that. The girl in the second row blinked. Her fingers curled around the edge of her chair. That question lodged itself somewhere between her ribs and stayed there, stubborn and luminous, because she realized in that instant that she had been trying to belong to everything except herself. To institutions, to mentors, to what her parents expected, to what her essays sounded like when they tried too hard, to what her reflection told her when she stood in fluorescent dormitory bathrooms, wondering if this version of herself was the one she had promised to become. And as Morrison spoke on, about language, about silence, about the sacred interior life, the auditorium faded into a cathedral, not in structure but in spirit. Each word she uttered felt like incense, lingering, weightless, and hard to forget. She didn't perform. She didn't lecture. She didn't even raise her voice. She just told the truth so quietly that you had to lean in, not just with your ears, but with your heart. And perhaps that's why, when the Q&A began and the microphone floated around the room like a sacrament, something inside that girl broke protocol. Her hand rose, slowly, hesitantly, almost rebelliously. She didn't plan a question. It wasn't neatly phrased. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was just what had been sitting inside her for too long. "Miss Morrison," she said, her voice cracking like old floorboards. What if I don't feel like I'm ever going to be good enough?" And that, right there, was the moment everything changed. But what came next wasn't a lecture, or a strategy, or even a pep talk. What came next was a pause. A silence so deliberate, so human, it felt like the room had taken a collective breath and held it. Toni Morrison looked directly at her and said only this, "You are the best you." 5 words. That's it. But in the silence that followed, something deep inside that girl, something that had been hidden beneath layers of striving and shame, began to rise. Because maybe, just maybe, being the best didn't mean being someone else's version of impressive. Maybe it meant being fully yourself, unfiltered, unafraid, and whole. She asked her question, and then came the silence. The strange how the world can feel like it stops. Not with noise, but with quiet. After the girl asked her question, there wasn't a ripple of laughter or a murmur of discomfort. There wasn't even the shuffling of paper or the click of a pen. It was as though the entire auditorium had instinctively known that something delicate had just been placed at the center of the room, and no one dared breathe wrong around it. Toni Morrison didn't rush to answer. She didn't tilt her head in that rehearsed, "I'm about to say something wise" way. She didn't even blink too quickly. She just sat there, still, steady, grounded, and looked at her, not with pity, not with surprise, but with something rarer. Recognition. The kind of recognition that says, "Yes, I know that place. I have walked in that quiet sorrow too. I have lived in the house of not enoughness. And I have learned to leave the lights on anyway." That moment between the question and the answer stretched longer than anyone expected. But it didn't feel empty, felt holy. Like those few seconds were doing their own kind of speaking. The girl in the second row tried not to look away, but her eyes dropped for a moment, uncertain. She had just put her greatest wound into the open, and now she had to wait for it to be seen, and judged, or dismissed. But it wasn't. Toni's gaze never left her. She wasn't calculating a response. She wasn't crafting a metaphor. She was simply being present entirely to one person in a room full of people. And then, finally, she spoke. Not in a booming voice, not even with emphasis. Just a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. You are the best you. There was no fanfare, no elaboration, no explanation of what that meant or how it should be applied, or whether it would look good embroidered on a pillow or posted on someone's Instagram. Just 5 words. And then, stillness. The girl blinked. Her throat tightened. She didn't know if she was supposed to respond. Part of her expected more. Maybe a paragraph. Maybe a strategy to overcome her self-doubt. A reading list. A quote from Baldwin. Something. But what she received was something she didn't know she needed. A truth so bare, so startling in its simplicity, that her heart didn't know how to hold it at first. You are the best you. It was not a compliment. It was not comfort. It was a fact. A sacred one. A sentence that didn't ask for applause. It asked for acceptance. And in that moment, what made it revolutionary wasn't just the content. It was the context. It was who had said it. And how. Because Toni Morrison was not a woman who gave out empty encouragements. She didn't speak to fill the air. Every word she ever wrote, and every pause she allowed to bloom between her words, came from a lifetime of watching, of suffering, of surviving, of insisting on joy where none was offered. When she said something, she meant it. And she meant it now. You are the best you. The phrase echoed differently for everyone in the room. Some students felt inspired. Some puzzled. A few wrote it down without even understanding it. But for the girl in the second row, it was a sentence that pierced through years of shame and striving. She felt a slow warmth behind her eyes, a heaviness in her chest. Not painful, but like something had finally shifted after being locked for too long. No one had ever said that to her before. Not in those words. Not without conditions. Not unless it came with a follow-up like, but you could try harder, or once you reach your potential, or if only you lost a little weight, or when you learn to speak more clearly. This was the first time someone had told her, plainly, calmly, and without a hint of apology, that she was already something whole, something already worthy of being. It was terrifying and freeing, because if Toni Morrison could look at her in her oversized hoodie and her trembling voice and see not a project, not a problem to fix, but the best her, then maybe, just maybe, she could try seeing it too. She looked up. Toni Morrison was still watching her. But now the corner of her mouth curled ever so slightly. A smile. Not wide, not for show, just a whisper of warmth. And then gently she nodded, as if to say, I'm done speaking. Now it's your turn to believe it. The next question was already coming from someone else. The room shifted back into its rhythm. The spell had lifted. But inside her, something didn't shift back. Something had settled. The rest of the event blurred. She barely remembered the final applause, or the professor who gave closing remarks. She didn't even recall walking out of the hall. But she remembered the air, thick with meaning, like the room had been turned into a womb, a place where something had been born, or reborn. When she stepped outside, the evening had turned cold. Students gathered in small circles, buzzing with opinions, critiques, inspiration. Some debated Morrison's position on literary universality. Others were already editing their social captions to include a quote or two. But she walked alone, not in loneliness, in sacred quiet, as though her insides were rearranging themselves. She kept hearing it, over and over, the phrase, the voice, the way it was said. You are the best you, not perfect, not polished, not future you, just you. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't argue with it. She didn't immediately compile a list of exceptions. She didn't shrink away from it in fear. She just let it sit, like something you don't fully understand, but feel is true anyway. That night, she sat on her dorm bed with the lamp on low. She didn't reach for her laptop. She didn't scroll her phone. She just sat, arms around her knees, replaying the moment in her mind like a slow, quiet film. And then, she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She picked up a pen. Not to write something brilliant, not to impress, just to remember. On the first page of her journal, she wrote in small, shaky letters, "You are the best you, Toni Morrison." And then underneath, "I don't know how to believe that yet, but I want to try." The moment was never loud, but it changed everything. There are moments in life that don't arrive with thunder. No lightning, no spotlight, just a woman sitting in a chair, speaking with the weight of someone who has lived truthfully, and dares you to do the same. That was Toni Morrison's power. She didn't save the girl in the second row by making her feel better. She saved her by telling the truth, and trusting her to grow into it. She didn't believe it right away, but something had cracked open. The words didn't change everything in a flash. This wasn't a movie. There was no sudden montage of confidence blooming overnight. No dramatic transformation where she shed self-doubt like an old coat and strutted into the world a brand new person. No. When Toni Morrison said, "You are the best you," the shift wasn't explosive. It was subtle, internal, like the sound of ice starting to crack after a long, cold winter. Not visible, but undeniable. That night, lying in her dorm room with the lights off and the window cracked open to the early spring air, she turned the sentence over in her mind like a stone. "You are the best you." The words sounded too kind, too generous, almost naive. Wasn't self-improvement supposed to hurt? Wasn't worth supposed to be earned? She'd spent her whole life believing that being better meant becoming someone else. Someone more articulate, more composed, more impressive, more like the students whose essays got read aloud in class, whose parents were professors, whose confidence came pre-installed. She didn't hate herself. Not exactly. But she'd grown used to thinking of herself as a work in progress. Always not quite there, always behind the curve, always just one achievement away from being worthy of love, attention, admiration. But Morrison's sentence, it didn't ask her to improve. It didn't give her a task. It gave her back herself. And she didn't quite know what to do with that. The next morning, she woke up early. Not because she had to, but because her body didn't want to stay asleep. There was a strange alertness inside her. Like her bones were holding onto something fragile, and she didn't want to roll over and crush it. She went to class, took notes, nodded at the right moments, but everything felt quieter. Not outside but within, as if someone had turned the volume down on the critic in her head. Usually, when she spoke up in class, even just to answer a simple question, her inner monologue would launch. "Why did you say it like that? You sounded unsure. They probably think you're dumb. Look at her answer. She's so clear. You never sound like that." But that day, when she spoke a simple point about metaphor in Morrison's Sula, she heard herself differently. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't command the room, but it didn't apologize for being there either. And afterward, the voice inside didn't immediately attack her. Instead, it paused. And in that pause, she felt something unfamiliar. A kind of space. A breath. As if the part of her that had always believed she wasn't good enough wasn't quite sure anymore. That week, she wrote in her journal every night. Not because anyone told her to. Not because she needed material for class. But because her thoughts had become curious. No longer looping in self-loathing, but stretching towards something else. She didn't try to write beautifully. She just tried to be honest. And in that honesty, she found pieces of herself she had never noticed before. Sharp edges that had always felt like flaws suddenly glinted with something like strength. The way she overthought things, maybe that was just sensitivity looking for language. The way she couldn't always articulate how she felt. Maybe that was depth that needed silence before sound. The way she doubted herself, maybe that was a sign that she cared. She remembered something else Toni Morrison had said that night. Not to her directly, but to the room. "I never asked permission to be serious. I simply assumed I could be." She had never heard that before. Not in school. Not in church. Not in the world. She had spent so much of her life trying to be small enough to be safe. Not too opinionated. Not too emotional. Not too ambitious. Just enough to get by without being seen too clearly. But Morrison's presence, her words, her silences, they had offered something else. Permission. Not the kind granted by others. The kind you give yourself. And slowly, tentatively, this girl, who once curled into herself like a question, began to walk differently. She didn't turn into the loudest voice in the room. She didn't become class president. She didn't publish an essay that went viral. But she did one of the hardest things a person can do. She stopped apologizing for existing. She stopped editing herself in real time. She stopped shrinking in the presence of people who had always seemed brighter, louder, more together. And little by little, she began to inhabit her own mind, not as a hostile space, but as a home. She started rereading Toni Morrison's novels not just for class, but for herself. And this time, they didn't intimidate her. They invited her in. She underlined passages, not for analysis, but because they lit something up inside her. Like this one, "You are your best thing, beloved." It echoed the sentence Morrison had said to her. But now it rang deeper. It wasn't just a statement. It was a reclamation of worth, of identity, of voice. Months passed, and then one afternoon, while walking across campus, she ran into her former professor, the one who had organized the Toni Morrison event. He recognized her, smiled, and said, "You asked the question that night, didn't you?" She froze. He continued, "I remember because I think we all needed to hear what she told you." She nodded, unsure what to say. And he added gently, "You seemed different afterward." She smiled. Not wide, not for show, just enough to say yes. Something shifted, something stayed. And then, quietly, she said, "So did my writing." Because it had. Her writing, once tangled in insecurity, had become more precise. Not flashy, not polished for praise, just clearer, braver, less concerned with sounding smart, more concerned with telling the truth. She started submitting her work again, slowly, carefully, not because she was sure she would win, but because she no longer needed to. Rejection didn't crush her like it used to. Success didn't inflate her ego. She had started to measure her worth by a different scale. Not applause, not perfection, presence, honesty, ownership. She wasn't trying to become the next Morrison. That wasn't the point. She was trying, finally, to become fully herself. And somehow that felt like enough. Diamond with a dot, the shift was slow. But it was real. This is what happens when a sentence, short, quiet, and completely unmarketable, dares to tell you that who you are as you are is already whole. Not perfect, not complete, but enough. Because you are the best you doesn't mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you reject challenge or discipline or ambition. It means you grow from love, not from lack. It means you choose curiosity over shame. It means you learn to trust your own becoming without constantly comparing it to someone else's arrival. The sentence stayed with her. Then it moved through her. She never meant to repeat it. Not out loud. Not like a mantra or a borrowed wisdom. "You are the best you" felt too personal, too sacred. Like a message whispered into her soul, meant only for her. But time has a way of softening even the most private truths until they become part of how we breathe, how we stand, how we show up for others. And slowly, almost without realizing, she began to live as if the sentence were stitched into the lining of her every step. She graduated, not top of her class, not with honors, but with something rarer, an inner stillness. A quiet kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. That doesn't spike in victory or collapse in failure. A way of being that simply says, "I belong in my own skin." She moved back to her hometown, the kind of place that didn't know what to do with dreamers. She took a job at the local high school, teaching English. Some said she was wasting her degree. Others said she was playing it safe. But she knew otherwise. Because when she stepped into that classroom full of half-awake teenagers with more hurt than hope, she saw pieces of her old self in every seat. The girl who never raised her hand. The boy who never brought his book. The one with the perfect grammar and the panic attacks. The one who didn't speak unless it was a joke. And then there was Simone, 15, razor sharp, quick to roll her eyes, even quicker to shut down. Simone didn't like school. She didn't like being told to write about feelings. And she certainly didn't like being asked to explain what Toni Morrison meant in that passage about love and memory and ghosts. "It's just confusing," she snapped one day. "Like, what does it even matter? None of it makes any sense." The rest of the class went quiet. But the teacher didn't correct her. She didn't defend the author. She didn't make it a teachable moment about tone or respect. She just walked over, gently placed the book on Simone's desk, and said, "Maybe the point isn't to understand everything. Maybe the point is to recognize yourself in something you didn't think could hold you." Simone looked up, surprised, and something softened just a little in her eyes. It wasn't a breakthrough. Not yet. But it was a crack. That semester they read The Bluest Eye. Slowly. One page at a time. And the teacher watched how Simone, the same girl who claimed not to care, lingered a little longer over certain sentences. How she started to underline passages in pencil. How she stayed after class once, holding the book a little too tightly. "Do you think Toni Morrison was mad when she wrote this?" Simone asked. "No," the teacher said. "I think she was honest." "Honest like tired?" "Honest like brave." Simone nodded, and nothing else was said. But a few weeks later, Simone turned in a personal essay titled, "The Parts of Me I Pretend Don't Exist." And the last line read, "Maybe I don't need to change to be someone. Maybe I'm already someone." It wasn't the exact quote, but it was the ripple. The teacher didn't frame the essay. She didn't post it on social media or read it aloud as an example of brilliance. She just wrote at the bottom of the page, "You're more powerful than you realize, and you don't have to earn your own worth." Simone didn't say anything in response. But the next day she stayed after class again. Just sat there, quietly, as if the silence meant something now. And for the rest of the year, every time a new student sighed, "I don't think I can do this," the teacher would reply, not with false encouragement, but with something deeper. "I know that feeling, but feelings aren't facts." Or, "You're allowed to be scared, but don't confuse scared with incapable." Or, "Every once in a while, you are the best you." She didn't explain the sentence when she said it. She didn't attribute it to Toni Morrison. She let it hang in the air like a small, steady truth. Something students could pick up if they needed it. And some did. Years passed. Her classroom changed. The students didn't. The wounds just evolved, from visible bruises to invisible ones. From loud defiance to quiet withdrawal. She never tried to fix them. She didn't offer miracles. But she did offer presence. She listened. She remembered birthdays. She wrote notes in margins that said things like, "This sentence is beautiful. I hope you know that." Or, "I see how hard you're trying. It matters." And more often than not, she saw students begin to unfold. Slowly, like leaves in early spring. One boy, Caleb, had come to her class fresh out of juvenile detention. Hard jaw, no eye contact, a file full of behavioral concerns. But on the last day of class, he left a folded piece of paper on her desk. Inside, he'd written, "I used to think teachers only liked the smart kids. But you made me feel like I was more than my worst moment. I'm not used to that. Thanks." She never cried in front of students. But that day she did. Not from pride. From recognition. Because she knew what it meant to be seen. Not for what you produced, but for who you already were. And then one day it came full circle. A friend from college texted her a link. Toni Morrison Memorial Lecture Series, streaming live. She watched it late at night, alone in her apartment. A young scholar, someone she'd never met, stood at the podium and spoke about Morrison's legacy. They quoted interviews, letters, essays. And then, near the end, the speaker said, "There's a story I once heard about a student who asked Toni Morrison what to do if she never felt good enough. And Morrison simply replied, 'You are the best you.'" The teacher froze. She hadn't known anyone else remembered. And now here it was, said aloud. To the world. She watched as the audience nodded, murmured, sat with it. And in that moment, tears welled in her eyes. Not because she was the girl from the story, but because the sentence had traveled. It had survived. It had found other homes. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the awards. Not the published books. Not even the great speeches. But the sentences that stay with us. That echo in the classrooms of small towns, in the margins of student essays, in the conversations we don't know we're having with ourselves. She closed her laptop, sat quietly for a while, and then whispered the sentence one more time. Not for herself, not for Toni, but for whoever might need to hear it next. You are the best you. Diamond with a dot. A sentence doesn't change the world, but it changes someone's world. And when that someone carries it forward, not like a banner, but like a flame cupped in two careful hands, the light spreads. That's what Morrison did. That's what the girl in the second row learned to do. Not by force, but by living as if worth was already hers, and giving others the courage to believe the same. You are the best you is not soft. It's a revolution in plain clothes. It's easy to overlook the power of a quiet sentence, especially in a world that worships volume, where the loudest headline wins, where self-worth is stitched to achievement, and where every moment demands you be better, brighter, more. In a world like that, a sentence like, "You are the best you," feels like a whisper in a hurricane. But Toni Morrison never wrote for the hurricane. She wrote for the wind beneath it, for the stillness underneath the noise, for the part of you that doesn't shout but listens. And that's why this sentence matters. Because it wasn't meant to dazzle you. It was meant to return you to yourself. We are not taught to believe we are enough. From the moment we learn to speak, we're taught the language of comparison. Who's faster? Who's smarter? Who's prettier? Who's more promising? Even in our small victories, we learn to measure them against someone else's. Even our praise is laced with a kind of quiet warning. You're doing great, for now, but don't get comfortable. We are told to reach, to strive, to hustle, to compete. And none of that is inherently wrong. Ambition, after all, can be sacred. But somewhere along the way, ambition mutated into erasure, into shame, into a constant discontent with the self. We stopped asking what lights us up inside and started asking how do we win at being seen. And in the middle of that feverish race toward significance, we began to believe that who we are now, stripped of titles, filters, accolades, is not enough. That our voice is only worthy if others agree. That our body is only beautiful if someone else wants it. That our story is only important if it ends in applause. And that's where Morrison interrupts us. Not with judgment, but with gentleness. With a line that doesn't demand anything from us, doesn't scold us for trying too hard, doesn't beg us to stop striving, but simply reminds us of what was true before the striving began. You are the best you. It doesn't mean you're finished. It doesn't mean you'll never fall. It doesn't mean growth is unnecessary. But it means that even as you stretch, you're still whole. That you don't need to become someone else to be someone. That worthiness isn't something you achieve. It's something you remember. Toni Morrison didn't write this sentence to flatter you. She wrote it or spoke it as someone who understood what it meant to live in a world that constantly asked her to explain, justify, soften, translate, shrink. As a Black woman, as a writer, as a mother, as a person whose very presence in spaces of power was seen as an exception, not a norm. She didn't fight for space in the world by shouting. She fought by existing fully and refusing to contort her soul to fit someone else's frame. That's what gives this sentence its weight. It's not motivational fluff. It's resistance to every system that says you're too much or too little, to every voice, internal or external, that demands you earn love with productivity, to every narrative that makes you the project instead of the protagonist. You are the best you. It's 5 words long, but it stands up to centuries of erasure. Why do we resist believing it? Because believing it would require us to unlearn everything we've been taught about success. Because it would mean looking at ourselves with mercy instead of metrics. Because it would mean resting, not just physically but existentially, in the radical idea that our identity is not a performance. It would mean making peace with our past, our pace, our peculiarities. And that's terrifying, because for many of us, our entire identity has been constructed on trying. Trying to be good enough for someone, trying to prove someone wrong, trying to finally be chosen. And if we stop trying, who are we? If we stop fixing ourselves, will anyone still love us? That's why this sentence doesn't just comfort. It confronts. It asks you to stop waiting for permission to like yourself. It dares you to believe that maybe, just maybe, you're already someone worth rooting for. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. What does it change if you believe it? Everything. Because when you stop thinking of yourself as a problem to solve, you begin to live differently. You begin to write without apology, to speak without shrinking, to rest without guilt. You begin to show up to conversations not looking for validation, but offering presence. You begin to parent without passing on your shame. You begin to love people not as projects, but as reflections of something already beautiful. And when you fail, because you no longer interpret it as evidence that you're broken. You see it as part of being alive. That's the quiet power of this sentence. It doesn't protect you from struggle, but it holds you through it. It says, you are not late. You are not wrong. You are not behind. You are becoming. And becoming you, not someone else, is the point. Why does it still matter today? Because we live in a world obsessed with becoming everything but ourselves. Because social media teaches us to curate personas instead of live lives. Because the hustle never ends, not even in rest. Because we are praised for exhaustion and shamed for softness. Because so many people wake up every day believing that who they are is a disappointment, a placeholder, a failure waiting to be fixed. And in that world, you are the best you becomes more than a sentence. It becomes a defiance, a refusal to see yourself as a brand, a radical act of coming home. And maybe, just maybe, that's how revolutions start. Not in stadiums, not in speeches, but in silence, in a moment of eye contact, in a sentence passed from one hand to another, in a teacher writing a note in the corner of a page, in a mother whispering something to her daughter on a rainy afternoon, in a stranger remembering your name, in the look you give your own reflection one day when, for the first time in a long time, you don't flinch. Because someone once said, you are the best you. And it stayed. And it grew. And it changed how you breathe. In the end, it's not just a sentence. It's a seed, planted in a room full of strangers, watered by silence, grown in the dark soil of doubt, until one day, without announcement, it blooms in you and through you into someone else. That's what Morrison left behind. Not just books, not just words, but sentences that know how to live and liberate. What would Toni say to you right now? She wouldn't start with advice. She wouldn't look at you with pity or urgency or the pressure to be brilliant. She wouldn't ask you about your GPA, your resume, your future plans, or what you've done to deserve a place in the world. No, if Toni Morrison were sitting across from you right now, in your kitchen, your bedroom, your campus bench, your car at the end of a long day, she would sit the way she always did. Fully present, unrushed, unafraid of silence. She would wait for you to speak. And if you didn't, she'd wait longer. Not because she was testing you, but because she knew that some things, the real things, only rise when they feel safe enough to come out. And when you finally did speak, about how tired you are, how lost you feel, how the world has made you small, how you're trying so hard and still don't feel like enough, she wouldn't interrupt. She'd listen the way people rarely do, with her whole face. And then, maybe, when the tears have slowed, when your voice has grown soft from honesty, she'd say it. Not dramatically, not like a performance, just as truth. You are the best you. And if you started to argue, if you said, but I haven't figured my life out, or, but I'm so far behind, or, but I messed it all up, she would look at you even more closely. You don't need to perform to belong. You don't need to prove your soul is real. You're already someone. You've been someone this whole time. Because Morrison didn't believe in shallow affirmation. She believed in deep reclamation. She believed that your wholeness was not something you earn after suffering enough or succeeding enough. It was something you carry even when you forget it's there. So if you asked her, "But what do I do now? I don't know who I'm supposed to be," she might pause, let the quiet linger like a prayer, and then say, "Be who you already are without apology. And when you forget again, which you will, come back to this. You are the best you. Not someday. Not once you've healed. Not when you're loved, followed, hired, forgiven. Now, as you are." She would probably stand up then. Not in a rush. Just as someone who trusts you to walk from here. She wouldn't hug you if you didn't want it. She wouldn't promise everything would be easy. She wouldn't fix your life. Because that's not what her words were ever meant to do. They were meant to return you to yourself. And in that return, begins the quietest revolution of all. So here you are. Still you. Still becoming. Still learning to believe what she once said, what she saw before you did. You are the best you. Take your time. But don't forget. She didn't say that to impress you. She said it to free you. And maybe, just maybe, that's where your own story begins.